My sister sabotaged my wedding day. She called the venue an hour before the ceremony and told them the bride, me, wasn't coming. She told half the guests that the date had been moved. She arranged for the florist to be paid late so bouquets didn't arrive until after the vows. Then she stood at the back of the reception hall and smiled while people stared at me like I was invisible. It wasn't just that she ruined the day, she took public proof of something private I had been trying to protect, my family's faith in me, and folded it into pieces in front of everyone I loved. It hurt because I had already lost the safer things. I was 28, engaged to Ben, and living in my parents' house because the mortgage was still in my father's name. My mother had early-stage Parkinson's, and my father had retired a year earlier after a heart scare. My parents trusted Anna, my older sister, to handle the household finances. She had the checks, the online passwords, the signature stamp. I trusted her when she said she would help with the wedding logistics because I was stretched thin between my job managing the small bookshop downtown and the clinic appointments for Mom. I thought she would be on my side. Instead, she turned the logistics into a weapon when she picked up the phone at 2:10 p.m. and said, "They're not ready. Tell them it's postponed." She didn't speak for the vendors. She spoke for me. The venue manager believed the voice that paid the deposit and coordinated the family accounts. He believed the person who could access the house and the supply closet and who had the bank records. He believed her because for 10 years, she had been the adult in our family. On paper, and at least, I stood in my dress in the living room and watched through the living room windows as the limo left early. Drivers told there'd been a delay, and our guests, one by one, checked their phones and left. The reception hall filled with half the staff and 2 apologetic waiters. The rest of the room was a map of blank seats. At the time, I thought she did it because she didn't like Ben. Later, I found another motive. At the time, it felt like jealousy, like a vindictive shove from a sister who had always thought my life was a competition. But the hurt was deeper because she used the one thing I had been saving for, the wedding, to make me look small, reckless, and unreliable in front of everyone. She weaponized the very parts of me that were honest. I had trusted family. I had trusted the paperwork would be handled. I had trusted that my name on a guest list was enough. She made a spectacle out of those trusts. The setup that left me vulnerable had been slow. Our family had always been the kind that tamped down conflict and pretended money was a private thing. When Dad's heart problem landed us in the cardiology wing for a week, Anna rearranged our finances and said we needed fewer hands on the wheel. "Let me put everything under one account," she said, and I remember the way she smiled as if giving us a gift. She took the autographed checkbook, the online banking passwords, and the title deed for the house. She was meticulous. She set up automatic bill payments and transferred a few old CDs into a consolidated account for easier management. My parents were relieved. I was relieved. At the time, it felt like stability. My dependency was concrete. The mortgage was in my father's name. The house sat under their credit profile. I had savings, barely, enough for a small deposit and a couple months' rent, but not enough to pull a family out of a mortgage or to guarantee a wedding venue in a different state. Ben had steady income, but he planned to buy his own place after our marriage, so he hadn't signed joint loans yet. He didn't want to push my parents into anything. He trusted me to keep things honest with the family. So when Anna tightened the rails, it wasn't just because she had the power to make calls, it was because she could move money, sell a car, alter our living arrangements. She had the paperwork. She had the legal delegation we all believed would protect us through illness and age. We had handed her authority in a time when we mostly hoped for caretaking and order. It created a raw imbalance. She could press a button and a bill would be paid, or she could press a button and the funds would disappear. She assumed she was acting with the moral high ground. She told me once that she had taken the responsibility because someone had to be the adult, and when I pushed back because I like to manage my own credit cards, because keeping track of the bookshop inventory was my way of feeling competent, she patted my hand and said, "Let me carry this. You won't have to worry." So when the wedding unspooled, I had no immediate recourse. The venue supposedly had the authority to cancel if the person who made the booking called. The caterer was told their deposit had been pulled and the license revoked. The photographer texted, "Everything's fine," and they say it's rescheduled, and his message came through like ice. Ben stayed calm in public, but at home he was a different person, angry, small, and exhausted. He apologized to me in the kitchen that night, with his hands in his hair, and said we could just go to the courthouse the next week, and I could see how much of it had knocked the wind out of him too. He hadn't signed contracts with his job because there was travel coming up. He couldn't afford legal fights. He wanted to fix the thing in the easiest way. I didn't know how to fight Anna, and I couldn't afford a public fight without losing everything we had built. What followed were the escalation loops, 3 months of increasing pressure, each turn worse than the last, each one reshaping the field of battle. The first loop was manipulation and exclusion. Anna took the moral center and used it to exclude me from conversations about my own parents. She started scheduling doctor's appointments to make sure I'm involved, and then would turn up and tell me after the appointment what had been decided. She decided what medication Mom would try next, and then texted me photos of the pills as if I were at work and not entitled to the conversation. I would get home from the bookshop with shelves to stock and people to manage, and Anna would be sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through my mother's medical portal while calling me emotional for being upset that she hadn't told me. She framed it as care. Her version of care meant I couldn't make calls. And if I called anyway, she would smile and say, "You're stressed, let me handle it." It was gaslighting dressed as kindness. My reaction was quiet at first. I tried to stay calm so the family wouldn't fracture, but I began to feel boxed in. When I asked for copies of bank statements for the wedding deposit, she said there was no need, that she had everything under control. When I asked the lawyer about the power of attorney documents, the lawyer told me the form was standard and that Anna had been appointed in the event of an emergency. "It doesn't revoke your rights," he said. But the truth was that the paper gave Anna the practical ability to move money and make payments, and the rest of us deferred to her. In the weeks after the wedding, people saw me at the grocery store and asked, "Are you okay?" And I would smile and say, "I'm fine," because every burst of emotion fed her narrative that I was unstable and needed direction. The consequence of this exclusion was that I lost small things at first, a deposit here, a refund there. A photographer demanded half the fee and said, "We can reschedule if you pay the extra." My emotional response hardened into a kind of hyper-awareness. I realized I was being gaslit into apologizing for being the person inconvenienced. The situation got worse because Anna used the inconveniences as proof of my unreliability. She would say, "If you had been more organized, this wouldn't have happened." And people nodded because it's easier to blame a stranger's tardiness than to notice the person in charge was deliberately steering the wheel. The second loop involved financial pressure and humiliation. Anna started moving things around in the joint accounts, where she took money earmarked for the caterer and used it to pay an unexpected home repair bill she claimed was urgent. She told us the roof had leaked, showed us photos, and we believed her because no one wanted to antagonize the person who was doing the heavy lifting. When we questioned a missing wire transfer, she said, "It was misapplied, I'll fix it," and then she didn't fix it. Instead, she took out a line of credit in our parents' names and paid herself back for expenses that, in her telling, had kept the household from collapsing. I started noting odd expenses: a cash withdrawal at a gas station in a town 20 miles away, a payment to an antique store, a hotel charge on a date she insisted she had been home. When I asked her about them, she would change the subject with a small, practiced look of affection that made Mum reach for her hand. My reaction moved from quiet to confrontational. I printed statements and sat them on the kitchen counter. I told Ben everything and he said, "We need to document this. If she does anything else, I'll call a lawyer." A lawyer appointment was made and Anna found out through our mother. That same night, she packed a bag and left, saying she needed to stay with a friend because she needed space after the accusations. She apologized in a string of texts but refused to discuss the financials. The consequence was that we could not get the access we needed to protect ourselves. When you point a finger at someone who has the keys, you can be dismissed as hysterical. My emotional state bounced between anger and a pale, grinding shame every time I had to explain to a vendor that the deposit was gone. The situation worsened because she began to call our vendors herself and tell them my words were unreliable. They started to treat me like an adversary. The third loop introduced betrayal of trust on a deeper level. Anna began to conspire with a distant cousin who was a notary. They signed documents that made transfers look legitimate. They convinced a sympathetic attorney to notarize certain forms that consolidated assets. I found out when I went into the county clerk's office to pull copies of the deed, something my mother had asked me to do out of a sudden worry. And the clerk handed me 3 newly recorded documents transferring minor properties and authorizing a home equity line in Anna's name. The signature line had my father's name on it. It looked authentic. When I called Dad, his voice was small and confused. He didn't remember. He had been told he signed the packet in a week when he had been at the hospital. He trusted Anna to help him through the recovery and had signed, assuming Anna had explained. I felt like someone had removed the floor from under me. My reaction was hysteria, the kind that makes a person do badly what bravery requires. I called a lawyer and told them I suspected fraud. We filed a dispute with the bank. The bank said it would take time and suggested we place a hold. Anna's consequence was to ratchet up the humiliation. She invited guests to the house for a family meeting and then stood in front of us and said I had been lying about the finances to attack her. If you have ever been publicly accused in a living room, you know how people shrink. Mom looked at me as if she had been wrongly accused of harboring a criminal in the house. I couldn't prove anything in the moment. The situation worsened because the legal processes needed time I didn't have, given the mounting pressure of bills and the impending end of Ben's patience. At the end of the third month, I hit the low point. The bank had put temporary holds, the roof repair payments were still missing, and the small savings I had set aside to move out were gone because Anna had taken 2 large cash advances on our joint credit card and used them to cover her personal debts. Ben had started taking on more hours, but his job required travel and he couldn't be here to defend me every time Anna made a call. We were living like people waiting for an axe to fall. The most painful loss was not the money. It was the feeling of being abandoned in the place that was supposed to be our refuge. One afternoon, after a car repair and an angry call from the caterer demanding the remainder of their fee, Dad and Mom sat me down. Mom's hands were shaking in her lap. Dad looked tired. They told me they were thinking of selling the house to clear the accounts and move someplace smaller, and the phrase landed like a door slamming. I thought of every childhood birthday in that house, of the window seat where I used to read by the light, of the small porch where Ben had proposed. I thought of all the ways a home collects our ordinary bravery. I felt trapped and ashamed for a different reason. I felt guilty that I had not seen Anna for who she was sooner. Guilty for letting her take charge simply because it made paperwork easier. I felt like a person who had failed to spot a small crack until the whole foundation crumbled. That night, I packed a bag and slept on Ben's couch. He held me and said quietly, "We can go, Margot. We can get a small place. We don't need anyone to sign anything to prove we belong together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be the person who left. But leaving meant I would be the person who abandoned Mum and Dad when they needed help. I couldn't reconcile the two. It felt like choosing between my own future and my obligations. I felt trapped in a moral chokehold where every option punished someone I loved. The turning point came not as a revelation from another person, but as a mistake. Anna's mistake. On a humid Thursday morning, I went into the study to retrieve an insurance policy for Mum. The study door was unlocked. Anna had forgotten to close it, or maybe she had become careless or tired. On her desk lay a small ledger, a composition book with a leather cover. I almost closed it and left because my instinct told me not to be the person who rifled through another's papers. But the ledger had a sticky note on the front with the words "house funds, track," in Anna's handwriting. My hand opened the cover like a performing animal. There were lists, deposits, withdrawals, the names of vendors, and a separate column with abbreviations I didn't recognize. Near the back, in a slip of paper, tucked between pages, was a bank transfer confirmation in Anna's handwriting, dated the day before the wedding. It referenced a wire to an account in a bank 2 states away, an account in Anna's name. I stopped breathing. I sat down in her chair because the world had gone into vertigo. The ledger had been careless, numbers, dates, codes, but the bank confirmation was clean, account numbers, routing details, a line that said family funds. It wasn't only the transfer, there were notes, little comments like sell off barn items, market decent, followed by shorthand entries that read like transactions, deposit vendor funds, okay, and client payment, cover gap. And then, a page later, a draft of an email Anna had not sent but had saved in print. If we delay the wedding, The house sale stays with me. Final. It was a paper draft of logic I had only felt in the air. I thought of the smile she had given in the back of the reception hall. I thought of the way she had stood in front of our family and called me unstable. I thought of the checkbook she had insisted on holding. My reaction was not theatrical, and it was a sequence of practical steps. I photographed the ledger with my phone. I copied the bank confirmation. I emailed everything to myself and to Ben. Then I sat in the chair and listened to the damp sound of the afternoon. It is strange how evidence can feel like a lever. The ledger was a lever that shifted the world. It turned out a mistake. Her failure to lock the desk had undone months of careful control. I called the lawyer. I wrote an email to the bank's fraud division with the evidence attached. I went through the ledger line by line and made notes. That night, when Anna returned, she found us waiting at the kitchen table with a stack of printouts and a lawyer on speakerphone. I remember her face, the way you remember a photograph of a person who has just been struck. First the confusion, then the sinking comprehension, then the look of fury that had no place to go. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fireworks. It was small and inevitable. She kept asking, who did this? As if she had been setting herself up as a strategist and someone else, a ghost, had moved the pieces. The legal consequence was immediate in some ways and slow in others. The bank froze the accounts after reviewing the transactions. They flagged the wire transfer and placed a hold. The county clerk's office put a temporary injunction on any property transfers until signatures could be verified. The lawyer we had contacted advised us to file a police report, and while the police investigation would be slow, the first acts were public. Anna was stripped of her access to the accounts pending inquiry. The notary and the distant cousin who had signed the documents were summoned for statements. When employers started asking if there were charges, Anna's job in the regional office of a non-profit, where her reputation had been the most public asset, suddenly felt insecure. She had always been proud of that work. Colleagues who had once admired her began to ask questions. The face she made in the kitchen that night, the one I still see when I'm lying awake, was not triumph or fear alone. It was a person watching all the constructed layers of their life rearrange into a shape that no longer supported the fantasy of control. You could see a calculation enter and then collapse. For her, the ledger was the thing that undid her defenses because it showed a pattern that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding. It showed intent, and it showed premeditation. The look was a ledger's reflection in a human face. Faces line by line, balances, debts, and a final negative total where she had imagined profit. There were no dramatic arrests right away. Legal processes are patient things, but the consequences were swift in their human effects. The first several weeks after the ledger was revealed were a steady erosion of her social capital. The non-profit where she worked placed her on administrative leave pending an investigation. The local church, which had always been a place where she did soup kitchens and led fundraisers, asked the board to delay public events she managed. Friends who had celebrated holidays at our house began to choose sides. Our parents were devastated and felt betrayed, which is a particular ache I hadn't understood until I saw them go small and grey. When they asked Anna why she had done it, she said, "I had to protect us," and then would say nothing when asked to elaborate. Her silence filled rooms like smoke. Her life unraveled in measured, inevitable ways. She lost her job after an internal review concluded that, despite not having criminal charges at that point, her fiduciary lapses were unacceptable for someone in her position. References dried up. The line of credit she had opened vanished into defaults as the banks reversed transfers. Creditors called. The home she had been buying with what she thought were ill-gotten gains went into foreclosure when the sellers cancelled the contract. The cousin who had notarized documents faced a civil suit for negligence. The police eventually filed charges of forgery and fraud once they had assembled enough documentation. I sat in courtrooms and watched the legal process grind forward like a machine that had finally found its track. There is a moment in that kind of unspooling when the human face finally registers the totality of consequences. I saw it again at the arraignment. Anna sat in the front row of the courtroom with her hands folded, and as the judge read the counts, her face went through a private chronology. Denial, argument, then a muted grief that had nothing performative about it. She looked at me once, no theatrics, only recognition, and I felt the old chain of sisterhood tighten and then snap. Her life was not dramatized. It was, in legal terms, ruined, jobless, facing criminal charges, financially insolvent, and estranged from the family network that had sustained her. She had assumed that dismantling our safety net would build her independence. Instead, it destroyed the very scaffolding that had allowed her to claim she was the responsible adult. The consequences for me were not all relief. There was no sudden restoration of everything I had lost. The bank holds were messy. The roof repairs still needed to be done. There were legal bills. Ben and I moved into a small rented apartment because staying in the house while an investigation rattled the walls felt impossible for Mum and Dad. I would visit my parents 3 times a week, and sometimes Mum would cry and ask me to forgive Anna. There were moments when I missed my sister, when I found myself looking at an old photograph of us in the backyard with our knees mud smeared, and the ache of what had been lost made me dizzy. But there was also a reassertion of agency. The ledger, obscene and frank in its handwriting, had given me the basis to reclaim some things. The bank released funds for urgent repairs once they had enough corroborating evidence. The county clerk reversed the transfers that had been lodged in Anna's name. The vendors returned because they had been assured by the bank's fraud department that there would be compensation. People offered support in small, ordinary ways. Our neighbour brought a casserole. The bookshop's regulars sent a card. A co-worker offered to cover a shift. These were practical things, not a moral sermon. They mattered because they replaced the silence that had been Anna's most effective weapon. The most complicated outcome was the relationship piece. Ben and I did not get a picture-perfect reconciliation. We learned how to argue without calling one of us crazy. We learned how to fight the world without dragging our family into every corner. We didn't have a big wedding. We had a small ceremony in the municipal office 2 months later. It lacked the dress and the bells I had imagined, but it had witnesses who chose to be there by their own decision. And it had a few people who had stood with us when the media frenzy, brief as it was, cooled. My parents stood by us at that ceremony, and for the first time since everything collapsed, I felt like the person who had been lost returned a little. Anna's life remained in pieces, and that is what it means to say she had ruined her life. She was not killed by an act of revenge. She had made choices that had predictable consequences, and those consequences were enforced by law, and by the quiet refusal of people to trust a history of care that turned out to be a history of control. She had lost her job, her standing, and eventually much of the network that had relied on her. People do not have to forgive. They do not always recover. We did not celebrate her undoing. There was no victory party. There were no triumphal headlines in my family home. There were paperwork piles and court dates and therapy that made the wood of our living room smell like antiseptic for months. The payoff was not dramatic. It was a series of small, necessary restorations. Access to accounts, the roof fixed, a restoration of privacy for my parents, the return of a small sense of safety. I did not get back the wedding I wanted, but I got back the ability to make decisions about my life without someone else deciding them for me. In the end, what I remember most clearly is not the ledger or the courtroom or Anna's face, though those are vivid. What I carry is the shape of the ordinary. The neighbor who brought soup, the bookshop regular who left a note saying, "We stood in line at your reception because we believed you," and Ben folding up my dress and telling me he loved the person beneath the ruination. Those were the things that rebuilt me. The closure came slowly. Anna pleaded guilty to a subset of charges in a deal that avoided prison time in exchange for restitution and community service. She lost the house she had tried to buy. She paid back as much as she could. The judge ordered counseling and restricted her from financial management roles for a period of years. We have not spoken much since the plea. There are occasional emails, long, thin apologies without the specificity that would make them meaningful, and I save them in a folder I'm not ready to delete. If I had one honest assessment of what happened, it's that she made choices that were informed by fear and a hunger for control. She believed that by consolidating control, she would protect us. But when control becomes an architecture to isolate and exploit, it fails. People who are asked to sign away their autonomy do so out of love or exhaustion. And when that trust is broken, the consequences are painful and plain. Now, years later, I stand in a smaller house that Ben and I own with our names on the deed. The mortgage is in both of our hands. The parents moved to a manageable townhome 2 blocks from a clinic they like. My mother sometimes laughs with Anna on the phone, but the conversations are measured. We do not go to the same family birthday parties. The rupture lasted. It has become part of our ordinary history, the way a scar maps a wound. I don't relish the fact that my sister's face in court is the last honest photograph I have of the moment her life changed. I mourn the loss of what could have been, but I'm not ashamed of the reality I have built. If you stayed this long, thank you for listening to something that is both shameful and banal. If anything here rings true for you, if you have an Anna in your orbit, trust your instincts enough to keep copies of the important things. Hold onto your documents, ask questions, get a second opinion. The ledger was a mistake she made. Your mistake might be only trusting a person with your signature. That is not a moral failing. It is a practical vulnerability. If you found this story meaningful, please leave a like. If you want to hear more first-person stories like this, consider subscribing. And if you've ever been in a situation where someone in your family used your trust against you, would you share how you dealt with it in the comments?